auto rights are very important because when you show a client a model and you're going to tell them you're going to save them X amount of money, that's contingent on the PBM meeting their guarantees, right? So oftentimes what we'll do with our clients is that after the year, we run the model again, and did you save X? Ultimately, when you have audit rights in the contract, you can recover dollars.
Welcome back to Captivating Health Insights. This is part 2 of our episode with Kevin Kobielski, founder and CEO of Navion.
The Mark Cuban thing is so interesting. He's this, become this healthcare pioneer. He wants to change the industry because he realized as a business owner how it's so complicated. He was being taken advantage of, and so he's kind of sounding the horn. And so what impact have you seen his company Cost Plus Drugs make in the market so far?
Yeah, that is a tough one because I think he's got a solid model there, and I think his celebrity status certainly elevates that to if you make a phone call to somebody and say, hey, we want to move your drug over here, they know who Mark Cuban is and they've probably heard of that. So that's, to me, an easier sell than international. But the issue with that program is it's hard to do that at scale when you're targeting the member, right? So if you have a member that's on a generic and they have a $10 copay for a generic, and your whole pitch to them is go to Cost Plus and you'll pay less, and let's say you'll pay $5, right, for that generic. Now, that same generic could cost $1,000 through the PBM, but the member's only paying $10. So the problem is there's no motivation for that member to go through all the hoops to get the script sent over if they're going to save $5 per fill. So it has really limited the adoption of that program, where we're working on some stuff right now where we would target the employer, and in that situation that I just talked about, the member not only would pay $0, but may get an incentive and say, hey, we'll give you, making it up, a $100 Amazon gift card if you go through this, and we'll make it worth your while. So in that case, if the member's saving $5 per script, but they get a gift card and they're motivated to do it, and that employer ends up saving $12,000 a year, that employer will spend the $250 for the gift card, right? So that's been the issue with these programs. There's never a perfect solution out there, even though sourcing them there is good, but it's very hard to get people to do things, right? So if you have to call your doc, so first of all, you got to go to the website, type in your drug.
The employee has to do this all on their own.
Yes.
Gotcha, yeah.
Now, some of the PBMs have started to incorporate Mark Cuban into their technology where it comes up on the phone.
Okay.
It says there's a savings opportunity. So that's happening, but the technology isn't quite there yet, and there's some issues. But the key thing, like I think Mark Cuban's program's great. It's just they need some type of employer-focused strategy, because the employer's the one who is more motivated than the employee to get that, because the savings are more on the employer side, right? So
yeah, there needs to be an incentive. I mean, the system is working how it's designed to work. So if we want to change behavior, we do have to think about, okay, how do I incentivize the employee? How do I, cost sharing, things like that, make it free, give an incentive. And those are the things that I think we have an opportunity to be more creative here. Okay, so with Cost Plus Drugs, the employee has to do it all on their own.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think what is interesting to me too, all these different elements and how we structure the incentives, because like you said, if there's more incentive for the employer, but it's on the employee, then you're not going to have behavior change. Thinking about an incentive or changing the process. One thing that is also controversial is 340B pharmacies. What is your thought on those and employers and clients that use those?
Yeah, I think,
what is it too?
So 340B is basically a program that was developed by the government that allows individuals, there's certain criteria that hospitals have to qualify, that basically allows them to purchase those drugs for like indigent populations at a lower cost, right? So there's a whole 340B. It's usually associated with a facility. So you can go from paying $5,000 for Humira to $500 or $200, like it's that big of a differential.
Wow.
And just like anything else, American innovation, companies see that and they're like, well, how do we get access to that? Now, generally, in order to get access to 340B pricing, you have to go to a 340B doc that's associated with that 340B facility.
And they're usually like community hospitals, right?
Yes,
Like underserved
yes.
areas kind of thing. Yep.
Yep. So that's what qualifies someone for 340B. So a lot of companies came out and said, okay, we're going to reach out to employers and get them on a 340B program that allows them to get drugs at that lower cost. Now, there's a couple issues there, and this is why it's so controversial. Generally, those companies require that member to have a telehealth visit with another physician. So they could be seeing their physician for years, and now they have to go to this other physician to get a prescription,
Because you need a script.
for the drug,
Yeah.
right? And it needs to be written by this individual. It's very similar to what's popping up now with, like, you see these vendors online where you can get all sorts of drugs online and you have like a telehealth visit, like a lot of drugs for mental illness and erectile dysfunction,
Yeah.
all that stuff, hair loss.
Yeah, the row.
Yes,
Yeah, all those
so you
kind of
you
companies.
have that, and it's very similar, right? So you have that interaction, and they allow you to kind of get medication. Now that model's a little different because the whole model there is they want to get you to those drugs faster, and it's easier to have a telehealth visit with somebody than make an appointment with your physician and go through the whole thing. But at least with 340B, once you have that visit, that member then qualifies to get that drug filled at 340B pricing. The issue becomes is a lot of times those vendors don't pass through that whole 340B pricing. So that's what we found as far as the challenge with that. Now we're starting to see vendors that are doing that a little more. And I think ultimately what a nice solution would be is some type of quarterback or concierge service that would, depending on the situation, send that person to Cost Plus, International, or 340B.
Yeah, it's so complicated. You need that like
Right? Yeah.
navigator.
Yeah.
Which is sad, but there's so many different options, and the average
Absolutely.
person knows nothing about them.
Yeah, and it's complicated. And then you get the same games, right? So that 340B, again, there's no rebate. So oftentimes if you let the vendor run the savings report, they're not factoring in the rebate loss. So there is some complications to the whole 340B thing that have not led to its rapid adoption because of this whole idea that you have to see that 340B physician. And pharmacies make a ton of money on 340B because they buy it very cheap and they sell it. It's a very marked up drug. And then what you have is this whole ecosystem where the manufacturers are angry about it because they're saying that that wasn't the true intention of the 340B program, and employers are using it, leveraging it in a way that wasn't intended.
It wasn't. It was intended
Yes.
for underserved populations
That's right.
in those community hospitals.
Same thing with MAP programs, same thing with specialty copay. So not that anybody's feeling bad for the manufacturers. I mean, they're doing okay. But these are all tools, depending on the client, that you should be looking at, get that objective analysis of it, and then go to the client and say, here are the ups and downs of it, upside, and ultimately it's a client-by-client decision on what they want to do, because we have clients that adopt all of this, right? We call it kind of solution stacking, where you take one vendor or multiple vendors, stack them on top of each other and say, well, if they don't qualify for MAP, they go to International, or they don't have an International, they go to Cost Plus. So it's kind of the solution stacking that oftentimes works. And the other challenge there is sometimes those programs aren't allowed by the PBM.
The traditional PBMs don't allow that as
Absolutely.
much, so that's
Yes.
why the traditional versus the transparent would come in.
Yeah, so you have to find ways around that, and there's certainly ways around that. But yeah, there's a lot of perverse incentives set up for PBMs these days, unfortunately, and those incentives often, because think about that. So if you're a PBM and I'm telling a member that I don't want you to fill Stelara at your specialty pharmacy, I want you to go to this International, that PBM is probably making a huge margin on that. So they're like, we don't want you to do that.
Yeah,
right? So
we don't like that.
It's tough. Yeah, it's certainly tough.
One thing we haven't gotten to yet is the contract. It's all about the contract, right? I mean, a lot of things that we're talking about, it's in the contract, and that's how it's negotiated, and that's what's going to be executed. So what are sort of those red flags if an employer maybe hasn't had their contract looked at recently? What do you see most common?
Well, probably going to need another hour for that conversation. But I do say the PBM world now is like trying to buy a used car 10 years ago without the internet, right? Where or a car in even a new car, you never knew if you were getting a great deal. You didn't really have comparison. You were kind of at the mercy of the dealer, like you didn't know. But now with the internet and technology, you can say if you want a 2018 Honda Civic, you can find it anywhere in the U.S. and you get 6 of them. So that has really solved, that problem. But yeah, it is certainly an issue that is very hard to navigate for sure.
So because this is what you do for our captive members, like looking at the contract, what are the main things? Like where are employers most vulnerable or maybe most maybe taken advantage of, for lack of another term?
Yeah, so there's this contract, right? And these contracts generally are 30 or 40 pages. And the employer and sometimes the broker are not experts in PBM contracting, right? And there is a lot of wording in those contracts that can dramatically change the value of that deal, right? So a good example is exclusion. So you may have a rebate guarantee on a retail claim that's $300. And then I show you another contract that has one for $200. And you're like, well, I want the $300 one. But if they have the same claim population and half the drugs with 300 are excluded, yeah, that number looks great, but it ultimately, when it comes out, it's going to be less money, right? So there is a lot of that going on. And there's things related to generics and what qualifies as a generic versus a brand, because they have 2 different discount buckets. So there's a lot of games played, a lot of rebate games that are played, and it gets more and more complicated every year. Like we call them optics, where you can look at a contract. So I do training sometimes around this, and I show 2 contracts, and one clearly has better financials than the other one, and I always ask which one's better, and everyone's like, oh, this one, I want that one. And the answer is no, you don't know, because you don't know what the fine print is, right? So you got to look, usually, so there'll be a schedule, and then on the bottom in very fine print, there'll be all these things, right?
The exclusions you're talking about, like this looks great, but then you got to read the fine print because there's all these exclusions you didn't catch.
With our car analogy, right? When you see those car commercials and they have the lease offer, and then it's all that little wording at the bottom that you can never read. That's where the magic is, right?
Gotcha.
So when we go and look at a PBM, we have very specific ways to evaluate whether certain things are excluded. Another one that they'll look at is specialty lists. So generally, the specialty discount is different than if a drug is non-specialty, right? So if 2 PBMs have 2 different specialty lists, and you don't know, and you're just using one list, you could be pricing those drugs wrong because the lists are different, right? So I would say we spend 50 to 60% of our time going through all those optics in our model to make sure that our clients are getting a full representation of what their costs are going to look like. And that's part of the reason why I don't think it's helpful sometimes to show the client, here are your discounts, here are your rebates, because they're misleading, right? So those numbers clearly look better, but they're not. So it's hard to explain to somebody why that is, and go into a giant model with all these spreadsheets, and it's tough.
That's why you guys exist, because that's your job.
Yeah. And the reason why PBMs do that is they want to make money, right? And they want to make their deal look as strong as possible financially and make the most money. So that's the whole idea behind the optics. And a lot of PBMs do the optics. And I would venture to say that probably 99% of them do it in some fashion. Some do more than others, certainly. But it's very ubiquitous out there. We spend a lot of time on that. I think our RFP probably has 200 questions around just financial things. Like
when you're looking at PBMs that you're going to partner with and recommend to clients. Yeah.
As long as we can quantify the optic, I'm okay with it being in the contract, because, okay, fine, you want to have that in there, but we're going to show the client the impact of that. What ends up happening sometimes is some of the contract language is so vague that you don't know what it says. And then we spend a lot of time pushing back and saying, we're not going to accept this contract language. You need to do X, Y, and Z. And that's where we probably spend 60% of our time. It is a battle.
But that's where it matters. The devil's in those details, and it really matters.
Absolutely.
What about audit rights with contracts?
Auto rights are very important because, and we do this all the time, it's like when you show a client a model and you're going to tell them you're going to save them X amount of money, that's contingent on the PBM meeting their guarantees, right? So oftentimes what we'll do with our clients is that after the year, they're like, well, you told me I was going to save X. So then we run the model again, and did you save X? So it's important to have that function. And ultimately, when you have audit rights in the contract, you can recover dollars. Now, I will tell you that we had a client the other day. I think we recovered about $200,000 in additional rebates for this client because they were underpaid on rebates. I had a client, a TPA actually, years ago that we got them $1 million. We went back and got them $1 million because the PBMs aren't great at running their own, it's called like a reconciliation or an audit at the end. And oftentimes they will run it, we will compare it to what we ran, and they're wrong. So then we go back and forth, and ultimately it results in the client getting a check.
A compromise of some sort.
And it's funny because clients are like, oh, I got this check, this is great. I'm like, yeah, but they were holding on to your money. It's like the IRS,
You almost
right?
didn't get it back, yeah.
Yeah, so it's extremely important that you have audit rights and that you have someone auditing the contract that knows what they're doing and has experience pushing back on these PBMs, because I don't think there's a PBM we've worked with that we have not recovered money doing audits.
Really?
It's that
Like every
pervasive.
single time you find something.
Well, not every time, but every PBM, at least we find it. Some are worse than others. It's kind of a non-starter not to do that. Like no matter what kind of PBM contract you have to have somebody auditing that contract every year. So every year, make sure that someone goes through, audits it, and shows you that report. They'll show you the PBMs, because so this is the thing, the PBM will run their own audit report and they'll slide it across the table, and you're like, I don't know if I believe that, right? Because it's coming from the PBM. So we say, okay, that's great, we'll take a look at that, and we run our own because we have all the data, and then oftentimes there's differentials. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it goes the other way, where we feel the PBM is saying they owe more money than
Oh, really?
what the
So
client
sometimes it goes the other way.
We're like, okay, that's cool. We're cool with that. But if it goes the other way, we definitely say something, and because every dollar counts for our clients.
Yep. And then market checks is something that I've seen in contracts. We do that for our PBM deals for our client members. What is a market check, and why is that important?
Market check is the ability for that client or their representative to go to the market and compare the pricing that's in that contract to what's going on in the marketplace, okay?
In the middle of the contract, right?
So it varies. So some are annual, some are every 18 months. Some don't have any market check.
Because they didn't build that into the contract.
Yeah, I got to say, one of the great things that we do is we'll go in, and clearly there hadn't been a market check in 10 years on clients, and we go in and we see 40, 50% savings, because the PBM, if you're not holding them accountable, they're going to be like, well, we're making money, because I think from their view is like some people are really squeezing them, so we have to make more money on other clients. And if you're not doing that market check, we've had clients where they really just have evergreened their contract over and over and over again before we arrived, and their rates are 10 years old. And you're like, wow, like this is crazy, right? Mm-hmm. So the market check is almost as important as the audit rights. The best case scenario is you do it annually, right? But every 18 months is fine too. And then the PBM has to be willing to come back and say, we're going to give you better pricing based on the results of that market check. And generally the PBMs are okay with that. So once you show them, and they know there's a differential, but once you put it in front of them and you say, listen, this is what's going on, they will come back to the table, and they may not match the exact pricing, but they will certainly move the needle a little bit. I don't necessarily have an issue with contract length. So some people are like, oh, 1 year versus 3 year. I'm not so whipped up about that, because I think doing an RFP every year is a lot of work for the client. So I'm okay with 3-year deals as long as there's market check provisions and you know that deal's, relevant to the market.
Kind of the best of both worlds.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So market checks are certainly key.
What else would you say when you're talking with an employer that they need to consider? We've talked about the contract, we've talked about clinical, we've talked about different cost-saving strategies for procurement. What else would you say that they need to think about when choosing a PBM?
I think we touched on like transparent versus non, if you want to do traditional versus transparent. I think service obviously is a big deal. People may have opinions on whether that specialty pharmacy should be owned by, I think the other question people ask is, should I be like in the insured world, like, are you part of like whoever's doing the medical? That's a key question. But I think if the big thing would be group and member service and how that's being handled. I think, especially if you're going to start getting into like mail order and stuff, you want to make sure that's being done right. I mean, part of the problem with this world we're in right now is the literal frustration of dealing with any type of medical establishment. It's very time consuming and very confusing. So having a PBM that either has support or some type of concierge to help you navigate those things, I think would be something that you'd be interested in. So, but the things we talked about are that really the main ones. And when we talk to our clients, it's, pricing, clinical, the ability to have different contract terms that, and inside clinical, having all those programs. I think the more programs, the better.
So what would you say, looking into the future, or looking into your crystal ball, what do you think is coming down the pike for the pharmacy industry, and you think employers may want to be thinking about maybe coming up?
I think there's a few things. I think legislatively, both at the federal and state level, there's going to be changes that may require PBMs to have different disclosure requirements or provide data or disclose fees or not be able to. I was looking at one the other day where the PBM couldn't own the pharmacy, so like CVS, right? So I think there's going to be kind of a legislative impact. I think that it'll be interesting to see what happens with manufacturers assistant programs, whether it's specialty copay or MAP, because are the manufacturers going to continue to lock those down? So I think international is going to become a bigger and bigger piece of that. I think employers are going to start focusing more, and consultants are going to start focusing on more advanced models to quantify the clinical impact of programs. Potentially there's like right now we're looking at AI to do some contract work for us that can expedite that. So it'll be interesting. I don't know, like drugs keep going up and up and up. And, I think ultimately you want to have a healthy population. So certainly addressing the issues before they get to requiring medicine, I think, is the panacea, right? Like we don't even want, certainly people have to be on medications for various reasons, but overall health, exercise, eating well, all those things, I think lend itself to lower trend on the drug side. I just don't think there's a great model for that, right? It's hard to get people. And, you could talk about the food industry and all the different
so many things.
Macroeconomic problems there. But I think
Yes.
ultimately eating healthier, exercise, all those things will help that situation, and a little more transparency. And the other thing is there may be a movement to break up some of these very large organizations where the health plan owns the PBM or vice versa.
Is that vertical integration?
And then they own the rebate aggregator, like that vertical integration that's
Yeah.
happening. I think you may see the government trying to get involved in that and break that up a little bit because they have so much power. Yeah, so I think those are kind of the key things.
Yeah,
in the
no,
future.
I think definitely things to keep in mind, and it'll be interesting to see what happens the next few years. Before we wrap up today, I want to make sure that people understand, what Navion offers. Obviously, we've talked about, the consulting. Could you help me understand, though, the analysis that we've talked about and that you guys do? What does that look like, and what that is so helpful? I've seen it be so helpful for our captive members. What does that look like, and what's that process?
So that's probably a whole another hour-long conversation, but I'll try to summarize it the best I can because we have some very strong analytic folks. My partner that I came from the health plan with, he's like a data analytics Jedi.
Jedi, I like that.
He's able to take all this data, and basically what we do is we go through the contract, and for every variable in the contract, we put a marker in the model that quantifies that. We take the utilization, we apply trend, and we apply rebates, discounts, and all different factors. And ultimately what it spits out is a pretty good representation of a comparison between the incumbent, whoever that is, and multiple other PBM options. And we feel that that is the foundation of a group because we also look at disruption. So we compare formulary to formulary and determine, what kind of, not only how many people are going to be disrupted, but which drugs, right? So certainly you don't want somebody who's on a cancer med being disrupted, but if someone has to go to one inhaler from another, they're both brand products, it's not a big deal. So not all disruption is created equal. So the model is very advanced, and it's evolutionary in nature, where every time we see a new PBM optic or game,
And you'd get trick being played that they kind of
yeah,
switch
we
up
put
every
that
year.
into the model, right?
Okay.
So it's constantly evolving, and we're incorporating a lot of the ancillary programs we talked about, MAP, specialty, Mark Cuban's Cost Plus. So we're incorporating all those into the model so that you can see the full picture of what's happening, admin fees, everything, fees that if the PBM's charging a fee to get a data file, that goes in the model. So we want to quantify everything so that we give the employer all the information they need. Now, again, it's not purely based on financials, but generally it's important, and you want that model to fully reflect not only the financial impact, but the disruption. So that's the foundation of what we do on the analytics side.
And it's awesome. It helps them be fully informed to make that decision because there's a lot of factors.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, what's the lowest net cost? And what are some of those disruptors maybe you're willing to deal with and or maybe not, depending on
Absolutely.
the company. Well, as we close, any other thoughts you want to leave our listeners before we wrap up?
No, I think this is great. I think we talked about a lot of topics that if I was an employer, that I'd want to know these things. And I think thinking about those things and who your PBM is very important. It's going to become more and more important as drugs become a bigger piece of that. The other aspect of is the medical injectable side. So all the drugs on the medical benefit, we assist with that because there's a lot of high cost drugs there as well. So that's something that employers want to look at, what they're spending there. And the idea is that you want to drive people to home infusion and lower sites of care. There's a lot of margin built in over there too. So, I think we gave a good primer for folks that are kind of navigating this complicated space, and hopefully it's helpful for them.
All right, well, thank you so much for being here today, Kevin. The pharmacy world is so complex, and I really am thankful for your time, grateful for all you've shared with us. I think it will help simplify this complex industry a little bit, and just appreciate you being on.
Yeah, it was fun. I love it. First podcast, and I enjoyed it.
Yeah, you made it.
Yeah, I made it through.